Welcome to Future², the podcast all about corporate innovation and entrepreneurship. My name is Steve Gleveski, and each week I'll bring you authors, corporate innovation managers, entrepreneurs, and above all else, thought leaders on the topics of innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-improvement. Future² brings you a double dose of innovation inspiration every week to help you successfully navigate your innovation journey. Every Monday, I'll bring you a world-class thought leader such as Steve Blank, Alex Osterwalder, Neil Patel, Rand Fishkin, or Whitney Johnson, just to name a few. While every Friday, I'll bring you some quick, digestible insights myself to help end your week on a high before you head off for the weekend. Future² is proudly brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation hub, school, and consultancy that works with large organizations to help them adopt the mindset, methodologies, and tools required to explore new business models and disruptive innovation in an era of rapid change. If your organization needs support coming up with ideas, testing and turning those ideas into reality, incubating teams, driving cultural change, or connecting and partnering with startups, then visit Collective Campus online at www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast. Welcome back to Future². Today I'll be speaking with Parag Khanna. He's a leading global strategist, world traveler, and best-selling author. He's a CNN global contributor and managing partner of Hybrid Reality, a boutique geo-strategic advisory firm. Parag's latest book is called Connectography, Mapping the Future of Global Civilization. He's also the co-author of Hybrid Reality and author of the award-winning How to Run the World, Charting a Course to the Next Renaissance, and the international bestseller, The Second World, Empires and Influence in the New Global Order, which was translated into more than 20 languages. In 2008, Parag was named one of Esquire's 75 most influential people of the 21st century, and was also featured in Wired magazine's Smart List. Amongst his many endeavors and achievements, Parag has been an advisor to the US National Intelligence Council's Global Trends 2030 program and served in the Foreign Policy Advisory Group to the Barack Obama for President campaign. From 2006 to 2015, he was a senior research fellow at the New America Foundation. During 2007, he also served in Iraq and Afghanistan as a senior geopolitical advisor to the United States Special Operations Forces. We did unfortunately have some slight audio issues recording this one via Skype, so you'll notice some background noise, but look, I strongly urge that you overlook that because Parag has some incredibly valuable things to say, which are far more important. So without further ado, it gives me much pleasure to bring to you the one, the only, Parag Khanna. Welcome to the show, Parag.
Thank you, Steve.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the program. I guess before we get started, before we start talking about connectography, I know you're an avid adventurer, having traveled to over 100 countries across every continent, often hiking and climbing your way across numerous 20,000-foot peaks. Have you had the opportunity to do some exploring lately, Parag?
Well, it's more the urban variety, I guess you might say, given the constraints of traveling on a book tour and so on. Mm-hmm. I've been mostly in large cities for the last few months as I've been traveling around, so I haven't had any chance to do any real, a natural adventure, if you will. I've got a long list, let's say, that's still to be done though.
Fantastic. I like that, urban hiking. You've recently published your fourth book, Connectography, Mapping the Future of Global Civilization, which the former US Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel says is a must-read for the next US president. The book explores mankind's investment of more than $10 trillion per year in transportation, energy, and communications infrastructure, linking the world's burgeoning megacities together, and the profound consequences for geopolitics, economics, demographics, the environment, and social identity. Can you tell me a little bit more about what inspired you to write this book, Parag, and how it came about?
Sure. Well, this book is actually the completion of a trilogy, which I call my sort of world order trilogy. So It began with the Second World, which explored geopolitical dynamics between the three major imperial superpowers of the US, the European Union, and China. Cool. That was followed by How to Run the World, which was my exploration of the future of diplomacy in a landscape that resembles the Middle Ages, where empires, nations, cities, and corporations all intersect and engage and compete with each other, but also solve problems together in what I call mega diplomacy. And then connectography looks at the lens of infrastructure, transportation, energy, and communications as really the most revolutionary force of the 21st century, redefining relations or redefining world order from a system of nations and borders towards a world of megacities and infrastructure connections and supply chains. So this is the sort of arc of the trilogy, if you will, and it completes with Connectography.
Fantastic. And I guess in your book, Parag, you demonstrate how militaries are deployed to protect supply chains today as much as borders, and how nations are less at war over territory than they are engaged in tugs of war over pipelines, railways, shipping lanes, and internet cables. Can you elaborate on that for our audience?
Oh, absolutely. So I see this infrastructure competition everywhere. In fact, I call it competitive connectivity, because we don't win in this century by isolating ourselves, and isolating others becomes nearly impossible in a world of total connectivity. Instead, we compete to connect. If you want to influence Iran, then you have to be the most connected to Iran. Yes. If you want to influence Russia, you have to be the most connected in Russia. You can't pretend that isolation works anymore. And that competitive connectivity through infrastructure takes the form of these physical relationships that are built through supply chains. So China has become the top trading partner of 124 countries, whereas the U.S. is only the top trading partner of 56 countries. Now, this also means that China is dependent on those countries from imports, but it also has a lot of leverage over them. So the dynamics between or within those supply chains tells us a lot about how countries relate to each other. And I even bring this up to the macro geopolitical level of U.S.-China relations. The U.S. and China is a very different dynamic from the U.S. and Soviet Union, because unlike the Cold War, the U.S. and China trade heavily with each other. They have financial interpenetration, hold a lot of each other's assets, and something completely different from previous periods of interdependence is that they have supply chain dispersal. Much of what we make is actually made in other countries that may be our rivals. Yeah. And so, for example, as I point out, if the U.S. and China were to go to war, Walmart would go bankrupt overnight, because most of what the largest U.S. retailer makes is actually made in China.
Yes, and I think you allude to this in your TED Talk, which is how megacities are changing the map of the world, which I strongly recommend our audience checks out. But you've mentioned a few sort of flashpoints around the world, whether it be in the Middle East, Africa, parts of Asia, where for so long wars have been predicted to break out, but they never do. And I mean, I guess a lot of that has to do with this investment and this connectivity, whereby you've just mentioned, if China and the US were to go to war, then Walmart will go out of business.
Exactly right. And I found the same dynamic in many countries, or many pairs of countries, where the incentives to invest in each other and profit from that relationship, despite the geopolitical tension, outweighs the traditional political imperative to to fight wars.
Yeah. What's one such example that you've come across?
Oh, I mean, India and Pakistan is a great example. They have fought multiple wars, and yet today they are more focused on a most favored nation trading agreement and building a gas pipeline from Iran through Pakistan to India. Those are the two mega projects that will, one institutional and one physical, that will define the future of India-Pakistan relations, not the border dispute over Kashmir.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. And I guess to that point, you've mentioned this topic of, or this concept of moving from sovereignty to connectivity as the organizing principle of the human species. And you've mentioned, or you've, brought out some really interesting research about the growing disparity between infrastructure spending and defense spending. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Yes, indeed. I mean, connectivity and supply chains rest on this backbone of infrastructure, and we are now building trillions of dollars worth of infrastructure every year. The spending ratio between infrastructure and defense is now 2.5 to 1. So we spend about $5 trillion per year on infrastructure and only $2 trillion a year on military. And that gap is going to grow because we are now a population that's approaching 8 billion people. And we have been living off of borrowed time, if you will, when it comes to the existing infrastructure. So whether it's transportation or housing, hospitals, schools, airports, you name it, all of these utilities, grids, electricity, telecoms. We need all of this to house, to absorb, to employ, to empower a world of 8 billion people. And we've been falling way, way short on this spending. So I view this as a secular trend, you might say. It's very likely that this that this pattern of spending way more on infrastructure than on defense is going to continue.
Yeah, and I guess to that point, I mean, you've talked about the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank, and you've argued that the new arms race is to connect the most markets. And you alluded to that earlier when you said that China is now winning, having launched a wave of infrastructure investments to essentially unite Eurasia around its new Silk Roads.
Yes, and again, part of it is the advantage of inherent geography, which is to say that China has more neighbors than any country in the world. It borders 14 countries. And therefore, it has the ability to do this infrastructure across them. The United States, of course, only borders 2 countries immediately. And therefore, it's not a country that is prone towards a kind of infrastructure strategy. Now, America became America through infrastructure, right? Yes. Through the Trans-Pacific Railroads and the Erie Canal and all of the major projects, the interstate highway system that really made the lower 48 states in particular, a whole greater than the sum of their parts. Now, China doesn't want to fight a war with any of its neighbors, with any of those 14 neighbors, so instead it's choosing a strategy of expanding its influence through these kinds of infrastructural maneuvers that help those countries become part of its own supply chains, rather than conquering them with its military.
And you've also, you've argued that the US can only regain ground by creating a North American Union of shared resources and prosperity.
Yes. So if China is building through the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank a supply chain zone that encompasses, 24 countries and trillions of dollars of GDP, the United States also has to think about harmonizing or optimizing its functional geography, which is to say, how does it optimize land, labor, capital, production, and resources with its major neighbors? And it turns out there's a lot of complementarity, because Mexico is a growing country of 100 million people. It has very strong, growing middle class. And then in Canada, of course, you have vast natural resources and access to the Arctic. So my argument is that the U.S. should think of itself and its neighbors as collectively forming a North American Union superpower. And that's not the kind of mentality, as you know, that sort of reigns in Washington today, unfortunately. Yeah,
that makes sense. And I guess, when we talk about the United States, California is a great example to talk about megacities. Obviously, it's the 8th biggest economy in the world. So can you talk to us about the emergence of megacities and what the implications might be, Parag?
Yes, there are enormous implications, of course, to a megacity world, if you will, and in particular the 50 megacities that I write about in terms of having the most consequence on the world economy, being the largest demographic centers that are largely concentrated in Africa, South Asia, and the Far East. Those cities are really the centers of gravity of the world economy, and of course a number of major Western cities that remain very powerful, such as New York or Los Angeles or London, and so forth. So remember, though, that a world of megacities, a world in which cities are quote unquote, in charge, is a more progressive world, because cities don't think in terms of zero-sum territory. They think much more in terms of positive-sum trade and connectedness. So I'm generally hopeful, actually, about this situation.
Yeah, and I guess, with megacities, some of the challenges that it brings up in terms of, carbon emissions, property price increases, congestion, inequalities, and so on. So you've proposed this concept of sustainable urbanization. What is sustainable urbanization, Parag?
Right. I do argue that really is the number one priority in the 21st century, and I make that argument not just from the environmental standpoint, but also from the economic standpoint. Environmentally, of course, we know that cities are the source of a huge amount of global emissions. That's for sure. But we also see the lessons being learned and knowledge being shared across countries, so that cities can bring down their emissions, and that's a very important trend that's underway right now. So I use the examples of everything from electric cars to bicycle lanes to clean coal burning factories, switch towards natural gas, waste to energy. All of these sorts of things are going on. Then there's the economic, which is to say that affordable housing and transportation investments are absolutely crucial to empowering the poor and reducing inequality and avoiding the kinds of political or populist backlash such as we're seeing so widely today. So if we want to cure social ills such as inequality and also prevent such strong and potentially destructive populism in our politics, we should really think about sustainable urbanization as a crucial paradigm.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And I wanted to touch on emerging economies. We have about 2 billion people yet to come online in the next few years. And, we've seen the advent of micro-lending, mobile payments, basically influencing the quality of life in developing economies, increasing people's abilities to create an income, to make a better life for themselves. Education is taking off. And I guess I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what the influence of, the 2 billion people that are yet to come online will have on industry.
No, it will be very significant for a number of reasons. First of all, just from an ethical standpoint and from a connectivity standpoint, it's a remarkable achievement that most of the world's population already has mobile phones and that potentially everyone will have access to a mobile phone within 10 to 15 years. That scale of actual, tangible sort of connectedness has never been achieved before, so I think it's really remarkable. The other issue is, of course, in terms of the economic enfranchisement, if you will, because we know we can measure that a 10% increase in mobile phone penetration can add 1 or 2 percentage points of GDP growth per year to a given country. So it's clearly a very large catalytic effect that mobile connectivity in particular has. And if we want countries to be more focused on the services economy and job creation in higher wage areas, that often comes through the digital economy as well. So there's a huge amount of potential in getting the next 2 or 3 billion people connected.
So I guess connectedness has the ability to transform and empower small, traditionally powerless countries.
Oh, absolutely. So the countries, but in particular, it's their societies, it's their people that we need to focus on. And part of the issue around, urbanization that I write about is when people move to cities, they have more opportunity. That city will become more stable and prosperous. And there's no stable country without a stable city. So if we focus on, city building instead of this lofty notion of state building, we will actually achieve state building better.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I guess the final point I wanted to touch on, and we've kind of circled around this, but your book contends that new energy discoveries and technologies have essentially eliminated the need for resource wars, that ambitious transport corridors and power grids are unscrambling Africa's fraught colonial borders, and that even in the Arab world, there's an evolution to a more peaceful map as it builds resource and trade routes across its war-torn landscape. I guess I'd love to find out a little bit more about this notion that technology and new energy discoveries are creating more peaceful and harmonious societies, especially in, war-torn parts of the world.
Right. So, there is still obviously a risk in countries that are very scarce in key natural resources like water, that there could be civil strife. But I'm referring, for example, to commodities such as energy. So 10 years ago, if we were having this conversation, we would be fearing that there would be a U.S.-China conflict over Arab oil or African minerals.
Yes.
Instead, 10 years later, meaning today, the U.S. sells oil to China as a result of the tremendous discoveries of oil and gas in the United States. So it's very important to appreciate that because we have an abundance of certain critical commodities and like hydrocarbons, and because they're more distributed, and because we built the infrastructure and supply chains to create global markets for oil and gas, and food for that matter, there's less incentive for there to be war over them. And so the more infrastructure, the more connectivity, the more markets we have for these crucial things over which we have historically fought wars, the better off we are.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense, Parag. So thank you so much for that. Just wanted to close out with a few questions that I ask all of my guests. It's basically a little bit of fun. A couple of hypotheticals, completely unscripted, so let's see how we go. Question number 1, Parag, is if you could work for any company at any stage of the company lifecycle, who would it be and why?
Any company at any stage of the life cycle.
Yeah.
I guess it would be interesting to be either, Google's first 5 employees or Facebook too, for that matter.
Yeah, that definitely. I think Google, Amazon, Facebook, PayPal, any one of those big unicorns would have been interesting in the early days.
Indeed, because they've now become more than unicorns. I guess you could call them dragons.
Yeah, that's an interesting take on it. I mean, they are the modern day behemoths. It's funny. I had a conversation last week with somebody, and I was asking the question about large organizations and how they're slow to move, and the response was, well, Amazon, Google, they're quite agile, and it hadn't even crossed my mind that they are today's large organizations, whereas my mind was fixated on, the industrial age behemoths of the world. But yeah, Facebook and Amazon, I mean, if you look at their market cap, they had definitely dragons, as you put it. Question number 2, Parag, is if you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, who would it be and what would you ask?
If I could ask any question of anyone, dead or alive?
Yeah.
That's a really good one. I'm not sure exactly.
What's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Very, very difficult to think about. You put me on the spot. I've never been asked this question before. Let's circle back to that one.
All right. Okay. Final question is on lifestyle design, Parag. I'm obviously keen to find out from people like yourself what you do to stay on top of your game. Do you have any rituals or routines that you partake in on a daily basis, or?
Well, I just try to play as much tennis as possible. I tend to think that is my window to work-life balance, to fitness, to mental sanity, and it's been my favorite sport my entire life long. So probably just playing tennis is my centering experience.
Excellent. I imagine you did you catch Novak Djokovic win his 12th slam last night?
I certainly did. Stayed up as late as I needed to catch that, and it was a magical moment.
Yeah.
Certainly wish that it could have been me. I when I was a teenager, I used to look a lot like Pete Sampras.
Yeah.
So
I
just lacked the speed. I just lacked the pace on my serve, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, when I was 13, I had all the ambitions of playing in the NBA, but I stopped growing when I hit 5'8", so that was a bit of a problem. Okay, Parag, let's circle back. I've given you a bit of time now. So, who would you ask a question of?
Oh my goodness, I still don't have an answer for you, do I?
No. And you can't be the first person that hasn't answered this question.
I like to think that it's more interesting to reminisce about who we would ask who's no longer alive, right?
Yeah, of course.
Because there's still hope of reaching people who are alive. Oh boy. Well, it would be interesting to ask Lee Kuan Yew, since I'm speaking to you from Singapore. It would be interesting to ask Lee Kuan Yew if he does feel that he actually inspired the Deng Xiaoping strategy to liberalize modern China and to set it on the course to really become the world's factory floor and really anchor of the world's supply chains. I think that would be an interesting conversation.
Oh, there we go. That was a great answer. And finally, Parag, where can people go to find out a little bit more about you and pick up a copy of your book?
Right. So paragkhanna.com, Paragkhanna. And then Connectography is available everywhere right now, Amazon and so forth. But I recommend getting the hardcover because the maps are really beautiful.
Fantastic. We all appreciate great design. So thank you so much for your time today, Parag. You've been a great guest.
Thank you so much, Steve. Great talking to you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my chat with Parag Khanna. I found it incredibly insightful, and he definitely left me, and I hope you, with lots of food for thought. So before you head off, I just wanted to let you know that if you have an interest in blockchain, I'll be running a free class for banking and financial services professionals called Blockchain for Bankers. As the name suggests, I'll be spending an hour diving into what blockchain is and providing an overview of how it works, what it means for banking lines of business, and what opportunities it presents. You can attend this class in person if you happen to be in Melbourne, or tune into the live stream online. For more info or to sign up for this absolutely free session, head to tinyurl.com/ZAN3NGM. That's tinyurl.com/ZAN3NGM. So with that, as always, Future Squared out.